before we get back into unit 17, you guys put your pencils down for a second. I kind of want to go back to unit 21 for a minute. We talked about, in unit 21, we talked about interim interest. And remember we said interim interest was just the buyer getting caught up with their lender, with the interest payment that they owe the lender. So we figured out how to calculate interim interest. And specifically, we talked about when the buyer's originating a new loan. So remember we said when originating a new loan, the buyer always skips the first. They don't have a mortgage payment due the first after closing. Their mortgage payment is due the following month. So for example, if we were going to closing today, today's what, February 15th, the buyer would not have a mortgage payment on March 1st because they're going to skip the first. So if we went to closing today, the first mortgage payment would be due on April 1st. You make that payment on April 1st, they're covering March's interest. So today at settlement, the lender would collect interim interest that would collect interest from the borrower from the day of closing to the end of February, February 30th. I don't know that you'll see this on your test. I would be shocked, but I think it's important that in addition to interim interest, we understand how other scenarios of interest are figured, if you will. So let's talk first about the seller's loan payoff. The seller is going to pay their loan off today. Let's stick with this idea that we're going to settlement today. And again, put your pencils down. This is more food for thought than anything. So if we go to closing today, we're going to call this today being the day of closing. The seller would have made a mortgage payment on February 1st. And when they made that mortgage payment on February 1st, they would have been paying January's interest, right? Because interest is paid in arrears. Where's your rear? Your rear is behind you. So when the seller made their mortgage payment on February 1st, they paid January's interest. So we go to closing today. The seller's not around to make a payment on March 1st, correct? We go to closing today, convey property, the seller's long gone. So part of the seller's loan payoff, when the lender is calculating the seller's loan payoff, part of what they're going to do is consider the responsibility that the seller has for their interest from February 1st to February 15th. Now, they're not going to charge the seller for this at settlement. This is all going to be part of their loan payoff. Remember, the mortgage company, the seller's mortgage company, has got to notify the lender to the penny how much the seller owes to pay their mortgage. And part of that amount that they owe to pay off their mortgage is to calculate interest, in this case, for the first 15 days of February. This is for the seller. Questions on that? Calculate it to the day of settlement.
Yes,
the lender
Julie.
will get their money. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so you say the seller will have to pay up until the 15th of February.
Because that's when we're
Right.
going to closing, correct?
Okay, and so then the buyer pick up that same day and pay to
Two
the
different
30th?
loans. It's two different loans. The seller
Okay.
has their loan and the buyer's originating a new loan today.
I know. Okay, so if the buyer originate a new loan, do it still start at 215?
Yep.
So it's actually, so 215 is getting paid twice?
Well, you probably are dealing with two different lenders. It's going to be rare that you both have the same lender.
Yeah, but I'm just saying hypothetically.
Yeah, no, not hypothetically, absolutely. The seller will pay their interest for 215. The buyer will pay their interest for 215. So yes, two people, two interests will get paid on 215.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
it does.
The seller's got to pay off their mortgage. The buyer's originating theirs. They're starting theirs.
Yes, but seemed like to me, if it's already 215 has already been taken care of, if
Two
the
different
seller,
loans.
if the seller does it, why do you have to pay again?
Two different loans.
Okay,
Remember, the seller's loan has nothing to do with the buyer. The buyer's loan has nothing to do with the seller.
okay,
Two totally different things. The borrower is the buyer in this transaction. The seller is the borrower in their own transaction.
okay.
Any other questions on that? We can help our sellers when they say, what's my loan payoff going to include? We can tell them it's from the first of the month to the day of closing. The other scenario we talked about that we could see, if the buyer is not originating a new loan, buyer is not originating a new loan. Instead, they're going to assume the seller's loan. So again, if we go to closing today, the seller made the mortgage payment on February 1st, right? The seller still had the loan, the seller still had the mortgage, and they made the payment on February 1st. If the buyer assumes the seller's loan, the buyer's not originating a new loan, which means they don't skip a beat. If the buyer's assuming the seller's loan, they make the next payment, which is due on March 1st, right? We're not originating. Buyer assumed. So the seller made the payment on February 1st. Buyer made the payment on March 1st. When they make that payment in March, interest is paid in arrears, which means the buyer is paying February's interest. Is that fair for the buyer to pay interest for the entire month of February? Put yourself in the buyer's shoes. If you were assuming the loan, would you want to be responsible for a period of time that you didn't own the property? So how are we going to handle that? We're going to prorate. And we're going to do a debit the seller, credit the buyer. The seller owes the buyer for the period of time that they own the property. So when the buyer's assuming the seller's loan, we don't skip a beat. Okay, the seller made the payment in February, buyer makes it in March. March's payment pays February's interest. And we're going to do a proration for the interest. The seller owes the buyer some money. Question came in, would this be considered an assignment of the loan? Yeah, all the terms are staying the same. The payment amount, the interest rate, everything's staying the same. The only thing that changes is the name of one of the parties. Again, what are you going to see on your test? Buyers originating a new loan, calculate interim interest. But we could be asked questions, things for you guys to consider, food for thought, if you will. Any questions? Okay. Jumping back into Unit 17. We talked about the sales comparison approach. The sales comparison approach is what the appraiser does, one of the approaches that the appraiser takes to determine value. The real estate agent does a CMA, or comparative market analysis. Our CMA is the closest to the appraiser's sales comparison approach. Remember, the big difference between the sales comparison approach and the CMA, it's all about the verbiage. The sales comparison approach can say the word value. The comparative market analysis, the CMA cannot. I'm not an appraiser. I cannot give you value. The CMA gives you probable sales price. So what I did for you guys was pull a CMA. And this is pretty broad, just so we have something to look at. When you get into your MLS, you'll be able to do this clickety-click. So you see at the top here, we have our legend. Here's our MLS number, address, city. How many stories is the home? How many bedrooms? How many baths? How many half baths? The year built. How many acres, square feet? Cost per square feet. List price, sold price. And then DOM is days on market. How long was it on the market before it went under contract? So as you can see, this was Emerywood Forest and High Point. I found a couple comps for us to look at. If you were pulling the subject property, let's just say you were going to list a home in this area, in this market, you would use this to help your seller determine probable sales price. Probable sales price will help you determine what you should list it for. You can see I have 2 currently active listings in this area. And why this is important for a CMA, the active listings tell us what our competition is. Any buyer that is looking to live in Emerywood Forest and High Point, this is currently what we're up against. These are the homes currently for sale. We also have closed information. These are the homes that most recently closed. And if we go back up and look at our legend, if this is list price, then this is sold price. This is what it actually closed for. Notice I don't have that for active because I don't know what a buyer's willing to pay for it yet. But I do have the sold price. I know here on my closed what the buyer's willing to pay for it. And again, with CMAs, when you get into MLS, you can look at pictures too, and pictures do help. Look at the condition of the property. But again, we're just getting an idea, something for you guys to look forward to. So I could use this information to help my seller determine what I think their probable sales price is, and thus what we should list it for. We also want to look at things that are under contract. Again, I don't know the sales price yet. I don't know what it's going to close for until it actually closes. That protects the seller. What if I advertise the sold price in MLS and then this contract terminates? Now, every buyer out there knows what the seller is willing to accept for this property. So when we talk about closed prices, we don't actually see what they close for until they close. But again, this tells me at these prices, these features, these conditions, this is what a buyer, this is the price, the list price that put it under contract. So we can almost treat this as competition like we do with the actives. The one thing I could not find for you guys, because we're just not seeing it much at all, there's some out there, a few, but not many, are expired listings. And when you're talking with a seller to help them find probable sales price, expired listings are important because I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it's overpriced. I don't know that. But what I do know is at that price, we were unable to get it under contract. So at that price, a buyer was not willing to negotiate and go into contract. So again, just a sample CMA.
Julia, I have a question.
Yes.
Just to be sure that I'm reading this right. So sale list percentage, these were sold at 101 over the percentage rate, and it was only on the market for 5 days.
Welcome to this market. We listed it for $219,900. It went under, it sold for $222,500. We listed it for $175,000. It sold for $191,000, $170,000. Absolutely. What we're seeing in this market, Danielle, very good observation, is that our sale list price is over 100%, which means they're closing for more than what we're listing for. Buyers they have to be competitive in these multiple offers, so they're coming in at higher asking prices. I mean, I haven't studied these, and I certainly don't want to. This is not Emerywood Forest. I'm sorry. This is Londonderry Estates and High Point. I'm not certainly trying to say anything. We're using this for an example. But in this market, I would raise a flag over days on the market of 23 days and 18 days. Because in this market, I mean, my average days on market here is 5. My average days on market here is 1. I'm certainly not trying to say anything about these listings. Maybe there's a good reason. I don't know. I haven't looked into it. But that's the kind of thing that would raise flags. That's the kind of thing that would make us ask questions like, why have they been on the market for 23 days and 18 days? It's so funny to say this because, you know, it used to be before we got in this market, homes could be for sale for months, 3-4 months, 5-6 months. And as we started getting into this market, what we started hearing buyers saying was, for property that's been on the market for 2 weeks, buyers are going, what's wrong with that house? 2 weeks. That's the insanity of the market we're in now. If it's on the market for 10 days, buyers are going, what's wrong with that house? Why is it on the market for 10 days? We're definitely going to see that. Days on market come back up when that pendulum starts to swing back. We're going to see this come back up, and we're going to see the sale list percentage go back down. Hopefully we can get the sold price under the list price. Not hopefully, but at some point we will. And that's kind of what we mean by the shift in the market. The experts say we can expect 2022 to look very similar to 2021. I'll be interested to see what 2023 looks like. Welcome to real estate. I'm already moving on to next year. Other questions or comments? Again, just to give you a sample. And this is what you can take when you go to your listing appointment. When your buyer says, this is the one, write it up. How much should I offer? This is a CMA that you can do to help them. I think we have an Occidental on mute. There you go. These are the kind of things that we can do to help our buyers determine how much to offer, our sellers, how much they want to list for. Questions or comments on that? So that's a good refresher of our sales comparison approach, our CMA. After we talked about the sales comparison approach on Friday, we started talking about the cost approach. And remember, the cost approach separates the land from the structure. The cost approach puts a value on the land. The appraiser determines the value of the land. Maybe they use the sales comparison approach. Maybe they use the square footage method. The appraiser puts a value on the land, and then the appraiser puts a value on the structure. And we were in the throes of talking about how the appraiser can put value on the structure. And probably one of the more common is the reproduction cost, which says if I was going to build this building today, what would it cost me? What would it cost me to reproduce? And we last left talking about some other things with the structure other than the reproduction cost that the appraiser is going to look at. And the last thing we said was they need to also take into depreciation of the structure. Please understand, for our purposes, land does not depreciate. Structures come and go, but the land is always going to be there. Depreciation is the loss in value for any reason for the structure. Again, it's kind of like driving a brand new car off the lot. As soon as it hits the road, it starts losing value. It depreciates. And same thing with the structure. A structure 1 year old doesn't have the value that a brand new construction, just put the new roof on it kind of thing, costs. So what we're going to do now is talk about some different types of depreciation. We're going to break these down. So there's 3 categories of depreciation. Again, we're going to break them down in just a second. Physical deterioration is just ordinary wear and tear. Physical deterioration is just ordinary wear and tear. We have 2 different types of physical deterioration. The first type of physical deterioration is curable. It's curable because it's physically and economically possible to fix it. Physical deteriorate or curable physical deterioration, there we go, is as simple as routine maintenance, slapping a new coat of paint on it, replacing the roof when it's old. It's curable. It can be fixed. It's economically feasible to fix it, to repair it, to replace it. Incurable physical deterioration is not economically feasible. It doesn't make sense money-wise to fix it. And an example of incurable physical deterioration is structural issues. You start running into structural issues, you start running into some money. You're compromising the integrity of the home. It may not be worth fixing it. By the way, I feel the need to know, I'm going to subtitle myself. I am not a structural engineer, and I'm not telling you this crack is good or bad. I'm just giving an example of an incurable physical deterioration. It's just not economically feasible to fix it. Another type of deterioration or depreciation we have is functional obsoletes. Functional obsoletes are just outdated. Again, we have curable and incurable. Curable is economically feasible to fix it. Economically feasible to replace it. My bedroom growing up had blue shag carpet. And I'm telling you guys, I wished it looked as pretty as what this does here. My first apartment in High Point, the entire kitchen, the appliances, the wall, the floor, the entire kitchen was avocado green. That is a curable functional obsoletes. You can economically feasible to fix that. The whole kitchen, y'all, was avocado green. Incurable functional obsoletes, then, it's not economically feasible to fix. It doesn't make good sense money-wise to fix it. This little house that you're looking at was built in like the 1920s. It has 4 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. Back in the 1920s, that's pretty common just to have 1 bathroom. Today, we all want our own bathroom, don't we? It may not be economically feasible to put in another bathroom, to install. You may not have the room on the land. You may not be able to do it. And that's an incurable functional obsoletes. Another example of this might be a home that doesn't have centralized AC. Maybe they still have window units, window air conditioning units. It may not be economically feasible to install air conditioning. The third type of depreciation that the appraiser looks at is economic obsoletes. This is only curable. These are things outside of the property boundaries that may affect the property. My Winston-Salem people, this picture, this is out there, Griffith Road. Y'all know where Village Tavern is, right? Everybody knows where Village Tavern is. The Village Tavern, Griffith Road, drive down Griffith Road, go. When you to the very end of Griffith Road, you hit Clemensville Road. Y'all know what's on the intersection of Griffith Road and Clemensville Road? What you're looking at is the sewer treatment plant. That is an example of an economic obsoletes. If you've ever been out in this area on a hot August day and take a big deep breath, it does not smell good. Economic obsoletes. You live near a landfill? Economic obsoletes. It's outside of the property boundaries, but it may negatively impact the property. Anybody ever drive through Canton, North Carolina? Canton, North Carolina is up in the mountains. Canton, North Carolina is a paper mill town. It doesn't smell good. The whole town does not smell good. Paper mill towns are horrible. And the thing that concerns me, I had a friend from college from Canton, North Carolina, and she took me home one weekend. And the thing that concerned me was, I went, oh God, what's that smell? And she said, don't worry, you'll get used to it after a while. That's what people say that live in places that don't smell. You get used to it after a while. I don't want to. Yuck. Paper mill towns do not smell good. Chicken plants, yeah. Have you ever driven down to the beach? Caught a whiff of something driving down the beach? Those are economic obsolescence, things that we cannot do anything about. They're just there. Okay. The other thing that the appraiser is going to look at when they're putting value on the structure, remember, we're separate the land from the structure. Depreciation is something that they have to take into consideration, but they also need to consider the economic life. They may use the they may use the age life method. It helps them determine the effective age of a building. The effective age of a building is how long does this building continue to add value? And the economic life just looks at the number of years that the improvement is going to expect it to remain effective. If they put 30 years on it, understand it doesn't mean the building is going to fall down in 30 years. It just means it's past its economic life. It's no longer adding value. We had a classroom outside of the sewer treatment plant on Griffith and what did I just say, Clemensville, and it was like right across the street, and it was our alternative classroom when our main location was available. And I'd always sit in my car, 1, 2, 3, big deep breath, hold my breath, get out of my car, get my bag, get my purse, run in the door, and then I could exhale, then I could breathe. I didn't like breathing that air. It was not nice. When it comes to depreciation, probably the most common tool to help the appraiser and the accountant determine depreciation is to use straight line depreciation. And straight line depreciation says that the structure depreciates evenly over its useful life. So let's say we determine that its useful life is 30 years. That means it's going to lose value on year 1, it's going to lose value on year 12, year 20, whatever, year 27. Every year it loses the same value. So let's say, for example, we put a value of the structure of $500,000. We say its economic life is 30 years. So if we take 500,000 divided by 30, we're saying every year this structure is going to lose $16,667. Year 1, it loses that amount. Year 12, it uses that amount. Year 23, it loses that amount. Straight line depreciation. Accountants use this tool a lot as well when they're depreciating. So again, just as a little recap, the cost approach, you separate the structure and the land. You estimate the value of the land as if it were vacant. You estimate the value of the building, take it into consideration, depreciation, effective age. And when you bring them back together, you have the appraiser's opinion of value using the cost approach. Look with me, if you will, on page 448. 448. Here's our sample cost approach to value. Subject property is 155 Potter Drive. We put a value of the land. Length times width gives us the total number of square foot. We determine at 450 per front foot. So we got to value the land at $27,000. Plus we added our improvements. So the driveway, landscaping, etc. So I got a total value of the land of $35,000. Now we're going to put a value on the structure. We used the replacement cost. There's our square foot method. 1,500 square feet at $65 per square feet. Less depreciation. You see, we have some curable depreciation, some functional obsoletes. So we deducted the depreciation to get a value of the building of $81,750. Add the value of the building to the value of the land, and the appraiser's opinion of the value per the cost approach is going to put this at $116,750. Remember, we said the cost approach is the best approach for special use properties. So for example, churches, schools, libraries. It's also really helpful for new construction. We can use new construction or the cost approach for new construction. The appraiser can. Questions on the cost approach? The third approach of value that the appraiser may consider when trying to put their opinion on value on a property is called the income capitalization approach. And the income capitalization approach is the best to use for properties that produce an income. Rental properties, may it be a rental apartment building, a retail store. This is the best to determine value on properties that produce an income. And the basis of the income capitalization approach says the value of the building is determined by how much income does it produce? How much income does it make? How much rent do you collect? The income capitalization approach helps the appraiser and an investor determine the net operating income. The investor's net operating income determines their profitability. How much profit are they going to make on income producing properties? And one thing that the net operating income takes into consideration is the capitalization rate, which is the investor's rate of return. What the capitalization rate tells the investor, the higher the cap rate, the higher the risk. All investors have a different tolerance. A lot of it depends on their inventory. If you're an investor and you only have one investment property, all of your eggs are on that basket, in that basket, right? If you're an investor and you have 20 investment properties, you have multiple baskets that you can rely on. So capitalization rate, and each investor may have their own rate of return, but generally the higher the capitalization rate, the higher the risk. So I got a formula for you guys. Haven't figured out the T-bar yet. You guys take just a minute and jot this down. And then I do get to use the T-bar in a second. We'll talk about what all these mean. So this is the formula to help the investor find their net operating income, or the appraiser find their net operating income. The first tool that we look at is the potential gross income, also known as the PGI. The PGI is the dream. If I have 100% occupancy 100% of the time, what's the max I can make? What's the most amount of income that I can collect? What's the most amount of rent I can collect? You have all units occupied and you have all tenants paying every month on time. PGI is the dream. From the PGI, you deduct vacancy and collection losses to arrive at your EGI, which is your reality. The PGI says what's the most I can make on this rental property. The EGI says what am I actually making. Vacancies are common, even if you have the perfect tenant. If they move out today, because today's the end of their lease, you're going to have a couple weeks before you get the unit ready to rent to somebody else, right? So even if you have the ideal tenant, they're going to move out at some time. So you're always going to have vacancy. Collection losses, unfortunately, sometimes you got to take your tenants to court to collect rent. And if that's the case, you got to deal with collection losses. So your PGI minus your vacancy and collection losses give you your EGI. From your EGI, you deduct your operating expenses. Operating expenses can be managerial fees, janitorial expenses, landscaping, advertising. What are the expenses that you need to operate your business? Please note, operating expenses do not include debt service. I'll say that again, because they like to trick you with that. Operating expenses do not include debt service. Do we need a reminder about what debt service is? Okay, debt service is your principal and your interest. Debt service is what you owe the bank. Operating expenses do not include your debt service. So you deduct your operating expenses from your net operating income, or excuse me, from your EGI to get your net operating income. Once you have your net operating income, now you get to use a T-bar. And the T-bar says that our net operating income is part of our value that'll give us our capitalization rate. Your tests are going to ask you for value or the cap rate. They're going to give you value and ask you for cap rate, or they're going to give you the cap rate and ask you for value. They are not going to give you the net operating income. You're going to be expected to find the net operating income. How do you find the net operating income? Take your PGI minus your vacancy and collection losses minus your operating expenses. It's going to be a two-part formula. This formula is always calculated annual. This formula is always calculated annually. So when they give you monthly rent, When the problem gives you monthly rent, what do? Times it by 12. They'll give you monthly information. You got to times by 12. So why do I have a big plate of Oreos sitting there? Not just to make you guys hungry, not make you guys Jones for some Oreos. That's not me. That's not nice, is it? Some people remember this formula by thinking about Oreos. I don't care how you remember it. But the mnemonic, the trick to remember this, poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. Poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. I don't think Violet's doing too bad if she's eating Oreos every night. But if that's the trick that helps you remember that, great. But I need you to remember is potential gross income minus vacancy and collection losses minus operating expenses to get to net operating income. Questions on this before I turn you guys loose and let you do your own problem? Okay. So here's your problem. Take a few minutes. Remember the formula you just wrote down. Take a few minutes. Let me know in a private chat what you think the answer is.
Are we sending you a private chat or are we
Yes,
just
please.
working?
Yep,
Okay.
private chat. Yep, math. Yep. Without question marks. Or hopefullys. If y'all gonna be wrong proud. This is my answer. Thank you for the 5 or 6 explanation points. Yes, that's how you answer. Give you about 30 more seconds, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So what do we do first? First, you just read the problem, right? Just read the problem, take it all in. Each unit of a fourplex rents for $650 per month. Vacancy losses average 10% per year. Operating expenses are $1,300 per month. If the property is valued at $150,000, what is the investor's expected capitalization rate? Remember, when I do math, I always like to start with where I want to end. What is my X? What am I solving for? And in this case, I'm looking for my capitalization rate. I know my net operating income is part of my value. The value of the property is $150,000. Do I know my net operating income? Not yet. I got to go back and do some more work now, don't I? I got to find that net operating income. So I have a fourplex, which means it's how many units? How many units do I have for sale? 4. I have a fourplex that each rent for $650. So $2,600 per month. And we always want to calculate these annually. So my annual potential gross income, the dream on this fourplex investment property, the most I can make this year is $31,200. That's my potential gross income. That's if I collect rent from everybody the whole year. Everybody good so far. The PGI is my dream. How much can I make off of this rental property a year? From my PGI, I deduct vacancy or collection losses, which is 10%. 10% is $3,120. So when I deduct 10% from my PGI, I get an EGI. Let me do this. This is my PGI. I get an EGI of $28,080. The most I could make is $31,200. That's the dream. In reality, I'm only making $28,080 on this investment property. I deducted my vacancy losses from my PGI to get my EGI. PGI is the dream. EGI is the reality. From there, I deduct my operating expenses. The problem tells me my operating expenses are $1,300 per month. This problem is always solved annually. So I take 1,300 times 12, and I get annual operating expenses. $15,600. EGI minus my operating expenses gives me my net operating income. So my net operating income is $12,480. Any questions so far? Any questions on how I got to my net operating income? The net operating income was the missing piece that I needed on my T-bar, right? NOI is part of my value. So now that I know that, I can plug that in. The back fourth line means divide. So you take 12,480 divided by 150,000. And I get a cap rate of 0.0832. It's either going to ask for rate or percent. So if it asks for rate, you do 0.0832. If it asks for percent, you move that decimal over 2 places and determine that the capitalization rate is 8.32%. Got to know the formula. Got to know poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. Have a question? Yeah, you got to read these questions. Yeah, Clara?
Yeah, Julie, can you just reiterate that last point one more time? When you annotated as 0.0832 versus 8.32%?
This is the rate that my calculator gives me. Move my decimal over 2 places to get the percent. I just converted rate to percent. You're not going to have
Okay.
both of these. Either you're going to have lots of 0.08 or you're going to have percentages, right?
Okay.
Your calculator gives you a rate, but if the problem wants percent, then you just move that decimal over 2 places to the right. Okay, formula, flashcard. Got to know that formula. If you don't know the formula, you don't know what to do with all those numbers, right? Let's look real quick before we go to break. Finish up this little section. Page 452 in your book. $452 is our sample income capitalization approach. You have your PGI 100% capacity, $60,000, income from other sources, vending machines, and something called a payphone. Gives us total PGI of 60,600. From there, you deduct, in this case, we have 4% vacancy. So you deduct 4% vacancy to get your EGI. The max you can make is 60,600. In reality, you're making 58,176. That's the difference in the PGI and the EGI. The PGI is the dream. The EGI is the reality. From your EGI, you deduct all your operating expenses. So there's your taxes, insurance, your utility bill, maintenance, repairs, decorating. That one always makes me kind of roll my eyes a little bit, but there it is anyway. Replacement of equipment, legal and accounting, advertising, and your management fees. Again, operating expenses for our purposes are going to be everything but your debt service. A question came in, how do we calculate vacancy? We can't. They have to give us that. They have to give us that. Add up my operating expenses, 27,300. Deduct that from my EGI. EGI minus operating expenses gives me an NOI, net operating income of 30,876. In this case, we're told that we have a 10% capitalization rate. I take my NOI divided by 10%. to get value as indicated by the income capitalization approach, the appraiser put a value on this building of $308,760. Questions? Know the formula.
I asking me
Yeah.
why I make a plus. I make 1,500 plus 12 for 800. I confuse as desk.
You know, you're learned, right? You worked out the kinks. You won't make that mistake again, right? So that's what it's about. Practice, practice, practice. Okay. All right.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Let's take our break. When we come back, we're actually getting ready to wrap up. Believe it or not, we're getting ready to wrap up Unit 17. So let's take 10. y'all back. Let's take attendance. Any questions on the income capitalization approach? So we're going to talk just in 1 minute how the appraiser looks at these 3 approaches to value and where they go from here. Before we do that though, let's just pull out one more thing. A tool that some investors may use is something called the gross rent multiplier. What I affectionately refer to as the GRM, GRM. And what the GRM helps investors realize is how long is it going to take me to get my money back? If I invest in this property, how many months or how many years is it going to take me to get my money back? So they look at the sales price as it relates to the expected rental income. If investors are thinking about purchasing this investment property, they may not know what the actual income is. So if they don't know the actual income, the GRM can help them guesstimate. This is good for 1 to 4 unit income producing properties. Any rental property, they can look at the GRM. The lower the GRM, the better. The lower the GRM says you're going to get your money back sooner. Typically, not always, but typically, residential rental properties will look at monthly income. Commercial rental properties will look at annual income. But it's up to the investor and however they want to see it. Formula is pretty simple. Take the sales price divided by the rental income, and that gives the investor their GRM. So again, this is a good tool if they don't know the actual income. They're trying to get a guesstimate if it's worth purchasing. They can use the gross rent multiplier. Okay. So back to our appraisers. We talked about 3 approaches to value that appraisers may take to help them arrive at their opinion. So we talked about the sales comparison approach. The sales comparison approach is best for single family homes. We talked about the cost approach. The cost approach is best for special properties, churches, schools, libraries, new construction. And then we talked about the income capitalization approach, which looks at properties that produce an income. The investor's going to look at as many of the approaches to value as they can. They can almost always look at the cost approach, right? We can always put a value on the land and a value on the structure, but they're going to look as many of the 3 approaches as they can to help them arrive to their determination. And what the appraisers do is their final reconciliation. It's not simple averaging. It's putting a weighted value on whatever type of property that the appraiser is valuing. So for example, a single family home, the appraiser will use the sales comparison approach, and they'll use the cost approach, putting the most value on the sales comparison approach because it's a single family home, because that's the type of property that they're trying to give their opinion of value to. Now that we know what we know, let's go back to page 441. 441. And let's look at our appraisal again. So again, you got your subject property, the contract information, neighborhood information, the site and the improvements. That black bar that runs down the left-hand side tells you the different categories. Over on page 442, the appraiser did the sales comparison approach. They studied the subject property as it relates, in this case, to 3 different comps. They adjusted the comps to match the subject. Remember our hand trick? If you have a comp that's superior to a subject, you lower the comp, you adjust the comp to match the subject. Real quick, look over at page 443. They also use the cost approach. You see about halfway down, it says cost approach to value. Just under that is the income capitalization approach. It's blank. Clearly, this is not a property that produces an income. So the appraiser couldn't use that one. So they use the sales comparison approach and the cost approach. Go back to the bottom of 442. And there's your reconciliation. They put a value on it using the sales comparison approach of 265. They put a value on it using the cost approach at 265, 516. Based on this information, the appraiser gave their opinion of value at the very bottom of $265,000. And that's how the appraiser comes to their opinion on value. They're going to use as many of the 3 approaches as they can to help them come to their opinion. Questions on that? Comments? Anybody ready to sign up for appraisal school? So go back to 454. I want to talk about something else real quick on 454. The last paragraph in the reconciliation talks about something called automated valuation method, or AVMs. That's what you guys know as estimates. Any kind of automated value, for example, is your Zestimate. And here's the thing about the automated value. The automated value identifies a subject property, like right here. And then they just do a search. For example, maybe a 1/4 mile radius, maybe a mile radius. It depends on the density. But they do a radius search. They used everything that closed within that search within the last 6 months. And that's how they arrive at their AVM. It doesn't take into consideration the type of property, the number of bedrooms, the square footage, the year built, nothing. It looks at what closed in this radius, for example, a 0.25 mile radius within the last 6 months.
So Julie,
AVMs aren't the most accurate because they don't take other things into consideration. Yeah, I'm sorry.
my apologies, you just answered it. I was like, is it good to go off of that? Since
No.
it's
Sellers love going on, well, depending on the market, right? Sellers love it, especially right now, for example, because you're comparing, you know, the condo to the 2-story brick home, right? It takes nothing else. I've heard these things described before, you know, with a Zestimate. Imagine you're out in a fishing boat and you take your net and you drag it on the bottom of the ocean, and what you get is what you get. That's your Zestimate. Compare that to the sales comparison approach and the cost approach and the income capitalization approach. You're fishing, you're using specialized bait trying to catch a certain fish. So as estimate, you're out there dragging your net, getting what you get. With the appraiser's approaches to value, you're targeting. Questions on that? Comments? Estimates suck. And you'll go to a listing appointment and the seller will say, but my estimate is, I see that. That means nothing. Okay. Remember what we do as brokers. Let's take your appraiser's hat off. Let's put our real estate agent hat back on. We perform BPOs and CMAs. And we have certain license law and commission rule that we have to follow, specifically Article 6 of License Law and Commission Rule A.2200. No, you don't need to know those numbers. Just know that there is a license law and a commission rule that regulates how we do our BPOs and CMAs. And one of the first things that both law and rules say, we do not determine market value. We do not determine value for the purposes of originating a loan. That is the appraiser's job. When we do a BPO or CMA, we are determining probable sales price. Y'all write that down. Probable sales price or probable lease price. Never look at a seller and say, I think the value of your home is. When you say that, you just acted like an appraiser. And unless you're an appraiser, you can't say that. The real estate commission, yeah.
Sorry, I have a lot of questions about this unit. So what if you are working with a client and they're like, hey, well, my estimate was this. What is the CMA? Like, why is it so off?
Use the fishing example I just gave you. Right? Explain to them where this estimate came from. This is where I got my CMA. I looked at properties similar to yours, 2-story brick for 2-story brick, for example. This estimate did not. That's part of our job, is to help educate the consumer, especially when they're adamant over what they think their value is. Guys, I didn't get a chance to talk about this last week, but think about value is kind of in the eye of the holder, isn't it? Sellers have a different value on their property than the appraiser does and anybody else. To the seller, this is their home. Blood, sweat, and tears went into this place. Remember when little Johnny fell right there and skinned his knee? This is their home. To everybody else in the world, it's just a house. So sellers are going to come into it with a higher value in their eyes than others. And so we explain it to them, help them understand. The real estate commission says our BPOs and CMAs have to be in writing. Provisional brokers, which is soon to be you guys. Once you get your license, you'll be provisional brokers. We'll talk more about that in license law and commission rule. Provisional brokers cannot perform for a separate fee. Remember last week, for example, we talked about doing a BPO for a third party, maybe a relocation company, for example. Provisional brokers, you can do a BPO for a relocation company, but you can't charge a fee. So my suggestion as a BP is don't do a BPO. Let the broker and BICs do that until you can charge a fee. When you're doing a CMA as part of our general brokerage services, I cannot charge a fee. Nobody, provisional broker, or broker in charge can charge a fee. So when your seller looks at you and says, what should we list my house for? You cannot say, give me $200 and I'll tell you. That is part of my job, is to do a CMA for my sellers to help them determine what we should list their house for. It is part of my job to do a CMA for a buyer. When a buyer says, this is the house that I want, how much should I offer? I'm not just going to blurt a number out. I'm going to do a CMA to help them determine. And again, we only offer probable sales price or probable lease price. Don't put value in your BPO or CMA. I'm not determining value. Probable sales price or probable lease price. When we do license law and commission rule, Appendix A, when we do Appendix A, we'll see this again. We'll talk about it briefly. What questions do I have about the real estate commission stance on us doing BPO CMA? You'll get lots of training. You'll get lots of training. Your BIC will help you. Seasoned agents will help you. I know the Winston-Salem Board of Realtors offers CMA classes like once a quarter. I don't know about other local boards, but I know Winston-Salem does. They actually got one tomorrow. To wrap up this unit, speaking of value, as we just said, it's all through the eyes of the beholder, isn't it? You being the seller, your home, your property, tend to see it differently than others, don't you? I love the tax assessor. They see money, dollar signs. Questions, comments? This is through our appraisers unit. Those key terms on page 433. Key point review. It's a good review of the whole unit. 457 to 458. And then your student quiz, 459 to 462. Question came in, do you have to be a BP or broker to attempt the CMA? I don't think there's a law or rule that says you have to be licensed to do a CMA. However, if you're unlicensed, you don't have the tools. You don't have access to like MLS to get the closed information. And that would be my only thing. If you're unlicensed, if you're not a BP or a broker, how are you going to get? And the Real Estate Commission can't regulate you if you're not licensed. But again, question came in, how much do I charge for a BPA or BPO? I didn't charge. They just called me and said, we'll pay you this much to do it. It's all negotiable, right? Because it's a fee. But as a provisional broker, you can't be paid a fee. The math in this unit for you guys to focus on is primarily the sales comparison approach, the CMA, and then the income capitalization approach. Poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. So that's math concepts on 455 to 457. There are those 50 problems in the back of the book. These are the numbers that relate to our appraisal math. I'm gonna get a worksheet for you guys and learn test pass that I'm getting ready to show you in just a second. Okay, everybody have these jotted down? These numbers jotted down? So let's go and learn test pass real quick. Let me show you this worksheet that I'm talking about. In the Unit 17 material Learn Test Pass, I have a sales comparison approach worksheet. And what this does is it gives you a subject property. It gives you information about a subject property. And then it actually gives you 7 comps. And then it gives you values. And it says, using the above information, find 3 good comps and determine a range of the probable sales price for the subject property. So it gives you 7 comps, but some are better than others. And remember, sales comparison approach, CMAs, it's all an opinion. So you very well may have a different opinion than me. That's what makes them all different. Just remember, I can only look at closed comps. So for example, comp 2 is under contract. And while I can look at this as my competition, I don't know a sales price. I don't know what a buyer was willing to pay for that. So when you're pulling comps for the sales comparison approach, for example, we can only look at things that are closed. Of the ones that have closed on this list, what are the ones that are most similar to our subject property? So what I'm asking you to do is study your subject property, do your rows and columns, list all the features of your subject property, and then consider each comp as it relates to the subject, picking the top 3. Now, I did put my solutions in here so you can compare my opinion to your opinion, understanding it's different opinions. Some are better than others. Again, you want closed comps, not things under contract. And I think that's a good practice in understanding the sales comparison approach and looking for those good comps. And that's part of what you'll do in your CMA training. When you get with your firm, is some comps are better than others. So what are the best comps you can pull? What's the best for your client, for your buyer or seller? Any questions? Take a big deep breath. Unit 13. Unit 13 starts on page 351. Unit 13 is our insurance unit. Please note the word basics. We're not in insurance school. Have you guys figured it out? A lot of this class is teaching you just enough to be dangerous, aren't we? I'm giving you all this information, and then I'm following it with call your attorney, call your lender, call your homeowner's insurance agent. We're giving you just enough information to be dangerous. Same thing with this unit. If your buyers or seller has any questions about their homeowner's insurance, we need to advise them to call their homeowner's insurance agent. All policies are different. Not all homeowners insurance agents are created equally. So we need to encourage them to call their agent. But we're going to get some basics. So in this unit, we're going to talk about the different types of homeowners insurance. And we're going to explain some insurance issues. So to start, let's define some words. Insurance is the bilateral contract between the insurer and the insured. The insurer is the insurance company. The insurer is the insurance company. The insured is the homeowner. So we have a bilateral contract. How many sides to a bilateral contract? Two sides. Both parties have duties and obligations to each other. Basically, the insurer promises the insured, if your property's damaged, I'll cover it. Pay me, of course. Your property's damaged, I'll cover it. The insured pays the premium to the insurer. The premium is the consumer's cost of coverage. If a buyer is getting a loan, homeowner's insurance will be required. If a lender's involved, homeowner's insurance will be required. If it's a cash buyer, homeowner's insurance is highly recommended. And the premium is the consumer's cost, the insured's cost. Property insurance is also known as casualty insurance. It protects the insured caused by damage to the property and the permitted improvements. Permitted improvements. Most insurance policies don't cover unpermitted space. So remember, with unpermitted space, I can include it in my total heated square footage if it meets the 3 criteria. But remember, it's a material fact if it's unpermitted, because this very well may affect the new homeowner's insurance policy. So property insurance covers the property and permitted space. Liability insurance protects the insured for loss or damages caused by third parties on their property. Package insurance combines property and liability. There's some coverage and claims. You can guys look at page 353. That kind of goes over things that are covered. Then on 353 to 354, there are different types of insurance policies. We're not going to go through all of these. We're just going to pull out the more common ones. The most common homeowners insurance policy is the HOA 3. The HO3, did I just say HOA? HO3, sorry about that. HO3 is the most common because the lender requires a certain amount of coverage, and the HO3 provides that minimum coverage required by the lender. It gives the insured the greatest amount of protection. So remember when we went under contract, you're the buyer's agent. We got our buyer under contract, yay. Get your buyer working on the stuff that the lender needs, whatever documents the lender needs to get the loan through the first round of underwriting. And then get your buyer shopping for homeowners insurance and encourage them to shop around. Tell them to call Jake from State Farm and tell them to call Flo from Progressive. Have them shop around and talk to a couple. The lender will have to approve the coverage that they select. So we need this, the insurance agent will communicate with the lender, let them know what coverage they're going to provide and how much it's going to cost. If homeowners insurance, monthly homeowners insurance, remember that's your PITI, that's your second I in your PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. If that sets them over the monthly amount that they're approved for, we're not going to get loan approval. So have them shop for homeowners insurance while we're still in due diligence. Because if homeowners insurance is the reason we're not going to get loan approval, and the best I can do as a buyer's agent is get my buyer to terminate while we're still in due diligence so I can get their earnest money back. Another popular policy is the HO4. This is our renter's insurance. It doesn't insure the building. It only insures the stuff, the tenant's personal property. So the landlord would have a homeowner's policy. The tenant would have renter's insurance. The tenant's insurance may cover any damage that the tenant might have caused during the property. Question came in, they're getting rent quotes to present to the lender. Kinda, we're encouraging our buyer to talk to several different, they get to decide who they want to use, right? So they talk to Jake and they talk to Flo and they say, I want to use this one. And then they turn that into the lender. And the lender makes sure that that policy satisfies their criteria. So the borrower gets to choose their insurance, but the lender has to approve it. We're getting there. HO6 is our condominium, our condo owners. Why is condo insurance differently? Because condo owners don't own the structure. Condo owners own from wall to wall, paint to paint, sheetrock to sheetrock. So they're covering personal property and basically the fixtures. Again, you got a list. 353, 354. Those are just a couple that we pulled out. On page 354, we're going to define some more words. A condition is a limitation of coverage. An example of a condition would be covering a vacant property. And we're going to talk all about vacant properties in just one second. An endorsement is coverage for something not normally covered. So think of rare or valuable items. If you had an antique, for example, if you had expensive jewelry, you might add an endorsement to your insurance policy to cover that item. And an exclusion is a loss due to a specific event. So an exclusion is loss due to maybe acts of war or terrorism. Most policies do not include loss due to acts of war or terrorism. It's excluded. So when your buyer's applying or searching for homeowners insurance, one thing that the homeowners insurance company is going to pull, one thing that they're going to look at is something called the clue report. The clue report, comprehensive loss underwriting exchange, is an insurance claims database that looks at all the claims made in the last 7 years. People or properties with a lot of claims in the last 7 years can expect higher insurance premiums, higher insurance rates. So if the people have a claims history, if the property has a claims history, they can expect to pay more for homeowners insurance. If they're paying more for homeowners insurance, it might be enough to tip them over their approved amount, and we may not get loan approval. Not all people or properties are easily insurable. So they'll pull your clue report. Any questions so far? Everybody good with that? You go into contract, do your little mini celebration, send the contract to the lender, send the contract to the attorney, tell your buyer to communicate with the lender, get the information that they need. Once they do that, get them shopping around for homeowners insurance. Even if they say, my uncle's an insurance agent, that's who I want to use, great. Go ahead and call your uncle so we can make sure you can afford it. So we can make sure that homeowners insurance won't prevent you from getting loan approval. So let's talk about vacant and unoccupied properties. Actually, a little bit of history first. Homeowners insurance was a unit in pre-licensing many years ago, before many of us were around. And at some point in the past, they took it out of pre-licensing. They said, these guys don't need to know about insurance. 4 years ago, roughly 3 years ago, 4 years ago, they added it back to pre-licensing. And it's of my opinion that the whole reason this whole unit came back to pre-licensing was this slide right here. Listing agents. We need to explain to our sellers at some point before settlement, they're moving out. And if they're moving out weeks or a month before settlement and the home is vacant, we need to encourage our sellers to report that to their homeowners insurance. Tell your sellers when they move out to call the insurance company and report it as vacant. It's very likely that their premium will go up. It's very likely they'll have to pay more money. However, if they don't report it and something happens to the home while it's vacant, homeowners insurance isn't going to cover it. Vacant homes have a higher chance of vandalism, theft. And if the homeowner's insurance company doesn't know that it's been vacated, they're probably not going to cover it. You guys hear on the news every once in a while about somebody that broke into a vacant building and stole the copper wiring. Let's hope their insurance company knew that it was vacant. When your seller says, I'm moving out 3 weeks before settlement, you should have a flag go up and tell them to call their insurance agent. Can I make anybody do anything? Of course not. Am I going to document that I told my sellers to call their insurance? If I have this conversation verbally, I'm going to go home and send an email talking about, per our conversation, I think you should call your homeowner's agent and let them know the home is vacant. An unoccupied home, the stuff is still there. It's not completely empty. I don't think we see this as much with sellers. Again, sellers got to move out at some point. Now, if it's the day before settlement, you can bring it up to them, but the concern is when it's going to be weeks or months before settlement. Everybody understand what we're saying? Unoccupied should probably be reported to, but your rates aren't going to go up. Your premium's not going to go up. I have an uncle. We call him a snowbird. He lives 6 months out of the year in Pennsylvania. He lives 6 months out of the year in Florida. He's Pennsylvania in the summer, Florida in the winter. He's got 2 homes. One's occupied 6 months. You with me? It's there. It's waiting on him to return. His insurance company knows that 6 months the PA home is unoccupied. 6 months the Florida home is unoccupied. What questions do I have on this? In our offer to purchase and contract, we have a risk of loss provision. The other thing that we need to do as listing agents is explain to the seller that they got to keep homeowners insurance on their home until it closes, until that deed changes hands, because it's still the seller's home and the risk of loss is on the seller. So if we're under contract and the house burns down, the risk of loss is on the seller because it's still their home. Some homeowners think that we go under contract, yay, I'm going to cancel homeowners. No, you cannot cancel homeowners insurance until it closes. The seller's policy ends on the day of closing. The buyer's policy begins on the day of closing, which means on the day of closing, that property is doubly insured. And if the house burns down on the day of closing, my gut tells me it's going to come down to the time stamp that the new deed was recorded. What time did the house burn down? What time was the deed recorded? Tell your sellers they have to keep homeowners insurance until it closes. If closing gets delayed, then they need to extend that coverage for a couple of days. You have the risk of loss provision in your book on 356. Everybody see that on 356? Cross that out. The offer to purchase and contract has updated. So when we come back for break, we're going to go into our offer to purchase and contract and look at the revised risk of loss provision. Remember, anytime you see a form or provisions from a form in your book, ignore it and go to the forms and learn, test, pass. So cross that out on page 356. Let's take 10, and when we come back, we'll go look at it, learn, test, pass. Welcome back. So if we look in Learn, Test, Pass, the Unit 10 material, let's go back just for 1 second. The Unit 10 material is what holds our offer to purchase and contract, the current offer to purchase and contract. And specifically, there's a couple minor changes on the risk of loss. It's provision 11 in your offer to purchase and contract. Risk of loss or damage by fire or other casualty prior to closing shall be upon the seller. So the contract tells us that the seller is responsible for the risk of loss. Sellers advised to not cancel existing insurance property until after recording the confirmation recording the deed. Again, have this conversation with your sellers. Make sure they understand that they've got to keep the property insured until that deed records. The second piece of this is what happens if the home is damaged while we're under contract. And this is, I always find this very interesting. Buyer's obligation to complete this transaction is contingent upon the property being substantially the same or better condition at closing as it was the date of this offer was made, reasonable wear and tear expected. If it's not in the same or better condition, buyer may terminate this contract by written notice delivered to seller, and they'll get their earnest money deposit back. It doesn't say anything about due diligence, does it? This just protects the buyer's earnest money. So even if we're outside of due diligence, the house burns down, the buyer's going to get their earnest money back. If they terminate, they may terminate. If the house burns down and the buyer does not terminate, the buyer is entitled to receive, in addition to the property, the proceeds of any insurance claim filed by the seller. So if you're under contract and the house burns down, the buyer has a choice. They can terminate and get their earnest money back, or they can proceed to closing and get the insurance from the seller's claim. If I were a buyer's agent and we were under contract and the house burned down, yeah, absolutely. We're under contract, the house burns down, I'm the buyer's agent, my buyer looks at me and says, what should I do? Should I terminate or not? My answer to my buyer is going to be, call your attorney and call the seller's insurance company. Make sure they have all the information before they decide what to do, to terminate or not. I think we all know insurance companies aren't known for their rapid payout. So the buyer needs to try to get a timeline to understand how long to expect. They need that money to rebuild. That's what this is about. They need the proceeds of the seller's insurance to rebuild if they choose the property. If they're choosing it and they're going to rebuild, my gut tells me they really like the location, right? They really want to be here. But again, it's the buyer's choice. I'm just advising them to talk to their attorney and to talk to the seller's insurance company. A question comes in, does the buyer get the due diligence back? Nope, just the earnest money deposit. Other questions on this? I can't make that decision for my buyer, can I? All I can do is provide them with their options. I provide the options, they make the decision. Okay, so again, that's Our offer to purchase and contract in unit 10. And this is the 11th clause. What you have in your book is a little, I can't tell you offhand what's different. You're welcome to sit down and compare and contrast if you like. But I always direct you guys to the current forms, the current information. You always be tested on the current information. Questions on this? Risk of loss? Again, making sure we understand vacant versus unoccupied properties. Again, it's my opinion. This is the whole reason why we brought this unit back to pre-licensing. You guys have an advantage now over lots of agents out there that didn't have this in pre-licensing. Hopefully when they brought it back, they mentioned it in CE. Let your seller know they got to keep it insured. And if when they plan on vacating the property, they really should report it to their insurance company. What questions do I have on this? Do I have any insurance agents on the call? No? Sometimes I get an insurance agent. When we were talking about our contract to closing process, we also talked about possession. Buyer typically gets possession, i.e. keys, garage door opener, access to the property after the deed is recorded. Buyer should not be given possession until the deed is recorded. Remember in unit 10, we talked about some other possible scenarios that buyer and seller may agree to. We looked at a couple addenda. One was the buyer possession before closing. The other was the seller possession after closing. So we're taking possession at different times. Again, the parties can agree to do whatever they want to. If they want to agree to do one of these scenarios, that's up to them. We as the agents need to understand in both of these scenarios, one party is acting as the homeowner and should have homeowner's insurance. The other party is acting as the tenant and should have renter's insurance. The addenda that we have provided to us covers, rent, who pays utilities, who's responsible for lawn care. Those addenda are only meant for short term. I would define short term as 2 weeks. I think anything over 2 weeks, we should have an attorney draft up a lease. But what we need to do is make sure whomever you represent in this transaction talks to their insurance company and make sure they have proper coverage. They're either the homeowner or the tenant. Either the buyer moves in early or the seller stays after the deed has been recorded. Questions on this? Flood insurance. We've talked about flood insurance a couple times, but now that we're in the insurance unit, we're going to talk a little bit more about flood insurance. FEMA has designated certain areas as flood prone, which means they're prone to flooding. FEMA is our federal emergency management agency. They don't just identify areas and say, this is a flood insurance, give me more money. They help reduce the impact of flooding. Is there something they can do to the land? Is there something they can do to protect the structure? Flood insurance comes from FEMA. Flood insurance is above and beyond your regular homeowner's insurance. And if your buyer's buying a property that's in a flood hazard, they will be required per the lender to add on flood insurance. Please understand, the lender does not decide how much to charge. This is like one place, it's going to be universal. The lender can set their own rates and set their own fees for homeowners insurance and renter's insurance. When it comes to flood insurance, they charge what FEMA tells them to. And FEMA uses this algorithm. This is math you do not need to know. FEMA uses this algorithm to help lenders determine how much flood insurance to charge. Look with me, if you will, at the top of page 358. How much flood insurance the lender should charge is based upon those bulleted items. Where's the building located? How old is it? What's its flood risk? These are the criteria that FEMA look at to tell the insurance agent how much to charge, how much flood insurance to charge. Flood insurance can get very expensive. Again, if we're in a flood hazard and the buyer's about maxed out on their allowable monthly payment anyway, flood insurance could tip them over the top. And if they can't afford it, then we can't get loan approval. FEMA has a website. FEMA has a map. I always try to look at the map before I write a buyer offer up, because I want to know going into it if something that we need to consider. I'm not an insurance agent. I'm not FEMA. I'm not making any kind of guarantees. I'm just looking at the FEMA map to see if we have something to worry about somewhere down the road. We'll look at a map in just a second. So again, FEMA designates flood hazards. How much they charge depends on how much of a hazard it is. The type of improvement, FEMA wants to know, is this residential? Is this commercial? Is this industrial? So after class, when you go to FEMA's website, don't go now. After class, when you go to FEMA's website and you pull the map up, it talks about a 100-year floodplain. A 100-year floodplain does not say this property is going to flood once every 100 years. The name is very deceptive. The 100-year floodplain says that this area has a 1% chance of flooding annually. That's what the 100-year floodplain says. A 1% chance of flooding annually. And flood maps change. If we get a period of lots and lots of rain, we're going to have areas that flooded before that did not flood before. And there were areas that used to not be in a floodplain, 100-year floodplain. We had a bad storm come through, there was a flood, and now it's in a 100-year floodplain because there's a 1% chance. This slide makes me sad because I miss being in person with you guys. If we were together face to face, we would be right here, but we're not. So my Winston people, this is Stratford Road right here, and this is Knollwood. Your Chick-fil-A is like right here. Everybody knows where Chick-fil-A is, right? Everybody got your bearings. If my Winston people know where you are. When you cross over 421, that today is known as Salem Parkway, there's a whole bunch of residential areas over here. Those residential areas, some of them, there's a creek that runs right here. And these properties that border the creek are in a flood zone. If that creek floods, the property could flood. They got that 1% chance of flooding. Questions on flood insurance or the 100-year floodplain? Now you know. You could have almost walked to class back in the day. Our responsibility when it comes to flood insurance, we need to be able to look at the map. When you're listing the property, if your seller tells you, or when you look at the map and you see it, it's a material fact. If it is in a flood zone, we have to disclose that. And then we need to be able to recognize possible signs of flooding. What are possible signs of flooding? Any body of water nearby. Creek, stream, river, lake, pond. Think about it. I mean, a flash flood comes in, a heavy rain comes in. You know, those spring storms we get sometimes? Those things come in strong and hard. It causes creeks to become these rushing rivers. That's what we need to be on the lookout for. When you're at your listing appointment, asking your seller if they're in a flood zone, if they have to pay flood insurance, will just be on your checklist of things to verify, things to confirm. I had a listing once. Let's see if I can draw. So it was like on a cul-de-sac. Right, so you got the cul-de-sac. And the house was like here. The property was here. The house was like right here. And for some reason, I guess because I honestly think that this was the last home in the development, everybody else in this subdivision had like 1/4 of an acre or 0.33 of an acre. My guys had 5. So this property kind of went out and up, something like that. And the house was way down here. And at the very top of the property, 5 acres away, was a creek. The property was in a flood hazard, but my sellers didn't have to pay flood insurance because it was so far away from the creek. So asking questions like, do you have to pay flood insurance? I disclosed that. I still got a lot of calls on it, as you can imagine, from good buyer's agents. I see you're in a flood hazard, but your sellers don't have to pay flood insurance. That's correct. And without drawing them the picture. So that's why we ask questions. Again, our responsibility as far as this unit is concerned, we need to have the discussion with the seller, make sure they keep the home covered until it closes. And then we also need to encourage our buyer to shop for and secure their homeowner's insurance while we're still in due diligence. Again, if we have to terminate, as a buyer's agent, the best I can do is terminate while we're still in due diligence so I can get my buyer their earnest money back. It's better than nothing. Questions? Short, sweet, to the point. Key terms, page 351. Key point review, 359 to 360. And then your insurance student quiz, 361 to 362. Okay, how we doing? Everybody good? Just chucking right along. I'm going to stop sharing just for 1 second so I can switch out PowerPoints. I don't know why, but for some reason, Zoom doesn't really like me having more than one PowerPoint up at a time. I'm still trying to figure out all the quirkiness of Zoom. And where we're going next, if you want to guys start finding it while I'm finding it, is Unit 11. And Unit 11 is our tenant landlords. Unit 11 starts on page 309. Let me come back and get you guys. So Unit 11 is the relationship between the tenant or landlord. A lot of what we're going to talk about in Unit 11, maybe the landlord has a real estate license, maybe they don't. It's the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. After 11, we do Unit 12, which is our property management. Property management is bringing the agent into the mix, bringing the agent into the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. So first, we're going to just focus between the landlord and the tenant. And in this unit, we're going to talk about leasehold estates. We're going to talk about the basic characteristics of a lease. And we're going to describe leases and their purposes. What do leases do? So starting on page 310, we got to define some words. The lease is the bilateral contract between the lessor and the lessee. Both parties have duties and obligations to each other. The lessor, the giver of the lease, is the landlord. The receivee of the lease is the tenant. Please understand, a lease is a legally binding contract. So basic contract law that we talked about in Unit 9 will apply. It's a bilateral contract relationship between the landlord and the tenant. We test your memory a little bit. Remember way back in Unit 2? How long ago does that seem? Tell me in a private chat what you remember in Unit 2. I said there was one word that we could use to define an estate. Back in Unit 2, we said there was one word that we could use to define an estate. Does anybody remember what that one word is? A couple of you are venturing a guess. One of you got it. An estate is just an interest that an individual has in a property. It's the interest that the individual has in a property. And there are two different estates. There are two different types of interests. What we talked about in Unit 2 was our freehold estates, our estates of ownership. Now that we're in Unit 11, we're going to talk about the other one, known as the leasehold estate, sometimes referred to as non-freehold. So you got freehold and you got non-freehold. In a lease, the tenant has the interest of possession. The tenant has the possession twig. Remember our legal bundle of rights. So what you're looking at here are different tenancies, different types of leasehold estates. And of course, we're going to talk about them all, break them down. Before we do that, let's go off textbook for 1 minute. Your syllabus talks about a few things that are not in your book. We need to make sure we define. Privity of estate is the legal relationship between the parties that constitute one in estate law. Simply saying privity of estate, the landlord has an interest in the property and the tenant has an interest of property. What combines them is that legal relationship, is that contract. Privity of contract says that contracts are only binding on the parties to the contract. Landlord and tenant are the parties to the contract. So we're going to talk about the different types of leasehold estates or non-freehold, whatever you want to call it. There's a nice little chart for us at the top of page 311. It kind of summarizes what we're getting ready to discuss. And the first type, well, let me say this. When we talk about the types of leasehold estates, the things that differentiate them are how they end. What defines one type of leasehold estate for another is how those interests end. So the first type of leasehold estate is called an estate for years, also known as a tenancy for years. And in a estate for years, you have a specific beginning date and you have a specific ending date. And when it's over, it's over. We don't have to give each other notice. We both signed a lease saying it's going to start today and it's going to end a year from now on February 15th, 2023. It's an automatic termination. There's no notice. It's over. We can agree to extend it. The parties can agree to extend it. But the original lease has a definite beginning and a definite ending date. Please, please, please do not be confused by the name of this. An estate for years may be a year, it may be a week, it may be a month, it may be a date. What it is, we have a specific beginning date and a specific ending date. Again, don't let the term years throw you off. Another type of leasehold estate, also known as a periodic tenancy or tenancy from period to period, has a specific start date. It does not have a specific end date. It has to be ended by one of the parties. It is automatically renewed until somebody ends it. It's not uncommon for an estate for years to turn into a periodic tenancy. So you sign a lease with a tenant, you and the tenant have a good relationship for that year. Your tenant doesn't tear your place up, they pay you on time. They say, I want to stay. You say, great. You can stay until one of us says it's time to go. I don't have a specific end date. It automatically renews until one of us gives termination notice to end it. In your book on page 311, it tells us our notice period. How much notice does each one party have to give the other to end it? If it's a week-to-week tenancy, either party has to give the other party a 2-day notice. Month-to-month is 7 days, year-to-year is a 1-month notice. So we keep going. Periodic tenancy, we keep going until the lessor or the lessee ends it. Another type of leasehold estate is called an estate at will, also known as a tenancy at will. There is no official lease. The tenant is there because they have permission from the landlord. It ends when one party ends it. The difference in an estate at will and the periodic tenancy is it can end without any notice. No notice is required. You just end it. It's just done. No end date. It's over when it's over. We don't have to give each other notice. And then the last leasehold estate we have is an estate at sufferance, also known as a tenancy of sufferance. Estate at sufferance, somebody is suffering. Who's suffering? The landlord, because they got a dang tenant that will not leave. The tenant probably started with permission to be there. It probably maybe even started as an estate for years. The lease ended, the tenant refused to leave. You guys ever heard of squatters? The landlord is suffering. We're going to talk in just a bit. If I don't get there tonight, we'll cover it tomorrow. The landlord only has one legal eviction remedy, and that involves a court process. We'll talk about that again if I don't get to it tonight, which I don't think I will. Then we'll talk about that. I was fortunate enough one time to have a police officer in pre-licensing, and as he explained to us, getting somebody off of your property is not as easy as one may think, especially when the person had permission to be there to begin with. So you had a tenant, you had a valid lease, the lease ran out. Here's the deal. If the tenant pays rent, continues to pay rent, and the landlord continues to accept that rent, we have an estate from period to period. The rule of thumb says you pay, you stay. You stay, you pay. The tenant we're talking about in this situation is there without paying. So as long as the tenant is paying and the landlord is accepting, we got a period to period estate. Everybody hear what I'm saying? Everybody good with that? The landlord is suffering because they have a tenant there that isn't paying and they won't leave. And again, legal remedy for eviction. We'll talk about that. Questions on our different types of estates. Leasehold estates. State of possession, also known as a non-freehold estate. Then we have different types of leases. That little chart is at the top of page 313. We're going to break these down and talk about them. What defines the different types of leases is how rent is paid. So the different types of leases defines how rent is paid. And the first type of lease is something called a fixed rental. This is what we see typically in a residential lease. The tenant pays a fixed amount of rent, but none of the property charges. The landlord pays the taxes and the homeowner's insurance. Those costs might be rolled into the rent that the tenant pays, but the tenant pays the landlord pays the property charges. The tenant's not responsible. In these situations, what the tenant has is renter's insurance, protect their stuff. But the landlord is responsible for paying homeowner's insurance. Again, this is typically what we see in a residential lease. The rest of these that we're getting ready to talk about are different commercial leases, different ways that we lease commercial properties. One common way for commercial properties in a retail setting is to be paid a percentage lease. We see these, for example, in like the mall, when malls were cool. So in a percentage lease, tenant pays a base rent plus a percentage of their income. The base rent is going to be based off of square footage. Claire's doesn't have as much square footage as Sears, right? Sears occupies more space. They're going to have a higher base rent. In addition to the base rent, they're also paying a percentage of their income. May it be gross income or may it be net income. It's got to be spelled out in the lease. The reason the percentage lease is a red star is because there's math that I'm getting ready to look at next. I don't think you're going to see this math on your test. I feel confident that you won't, but they still want us to go over the math to help you understand how this works. I do have a couple practice problems for you on this in Learn, Test, Pass, the unit 11 and 12. If the math helps you understand it, then you can use the worksheet. I think there's like 3 problems on the worksheet, but just to give you an idea. So let's look at a problem together and talk about the 2 different ways that the tenant pays rent on a percentage lease. The problem says, based on the tenant square footage, the mall charges a base rent of $1,300 per month. In addition, the terms of the lease state the tenant will pay 5% of gross sales on any annual amount over $160,000. Last year, their sales were $250,000. What is the tenant's total annual rent for this year? So we start with looking at their base rent. The lease says that their base rent, they pay $1,300 every month. So 1,300 times 12. gives us a base rent of $15,600. That's their annual base rent. Doesn't matter what their sales are, that's their base. Everybody good with that piece of it? The second piece is a percentage of their sales. And it says we're going to pay 5% on any amount over 160. So if sales are bad last year and you only have $159,000 in sales, all you're going to pay is the base rent. You only pay the percentage on any amount over 160. Last year's sales were $250,000. So we need to first find the difference. What is the amount over to 160,000? The amount over 150,000, no, 160,000 is $90,000. And we're going to take 5% of that. So now we have, in addition to the base rent, $4,500. So I got my annual base rent plus my amount over, which means the tenant's rent this year is going to be $20,100. Part of what the tenant's agreeing to, obviously they got to turn their books over to the landlord, right? To whomever owns the mall. So they know what that percentage is. You want to take monthly, take this 20,100, divide by 12. That's how much the tenant will pay this year or this month, however you want to look at that, in rent. There's common areas in malls, right? Common restrooms, common areas, parking lot. Everybody's going to chip in to help keep them all. There are a couple visitors we like to bring in a couple times a year. The mall likes to bring in Santa. They like to bring in the Easter Bunny. Santa costs money to come in. Questions on percentage lease. Okay, everybody good if I erase this? Another type of lease we may see in commercial, something called a net lease. In a net lease, the tenant pays the rent, and in addition to the rent, they may pay some or all the property charges. So they pay rent, but then they also get to pay for maintenance and property taxes and maybe homeowners insurance. Net lease. We also have a graduated lease, again, for commercial properties. With a graduated lease, the rent increases at predetermined dates. Think of a startup company. I may sign as a startup company a 3-year lease. I'm going to pay X amount this year, X amount on year 1, X amount on year 2, X amount on year 3. Presumably with a startup company, as my rent is increasing, so is the income from my business. By the way, most commercial leases are going to be multiple years. Most. Anything's negotiable. So you could have 3-year lease, graduated lease. Each year the rent goes up, for example. An index lease, another commercial lease, rent fluctuates up and down based on agreed upon index. An example might be the government's cost of living index. As the cost of living goes up, rent goes up. Cost of living goes down, rent goes down. We're deciding on some index to determine how much rent is. Another type of lease is our ground lease. Again, a commercial lease. In this lease, the tenant pays rent on the land and then they build. So the tenant rents the land and then they build the structure. These are long-term leases. Sometimes we're talking about 99 years. This is how a lot of our Walmarts operate. Say what you want to about Walmart, but they're brilliant. They buy the land, they rent the land. A Walmart franchisee comes in and says, I want to franchise a Walmart. They have to build the Walmart while they're paying rent on the land. And oh yes, Walmart's getting a percentage of the proceeds of the sales too. So they're getting rent and they're getting proceeds of the sales. Genius. Verizon may have a ground lease where their towers are. They rent the land and build their cell phone towers. I wish if I could go back in time, do y'all ever do that? If I could go back in time and buy something, I would buy a hunk of land that Verizon wanted to put a cell phone tower on, where they just send me a check every month for having their tower on. That's a ground lease. We also have a full service lease. Again, a commercial lease. This is when you have multiple tenants in the same building. So think of like an office park, for example, an office building. Part of the rent goes towards maintaining the common areas. Maybe you have a common janitorial staff that cleans the whole building. Maybe you have common restrooms. Maybe you have a common maintenance man, one maintenance person that maintains the whole building. Rents go towards paying for those janitorial fees and the maintenance persons. Just as a side note, I skipped over it, but just as a side note, there's an oil and mineral lease on page 314. If the oil company wants to take your oil, maybe they do an oil and mineral lease. You give them permission to be there to, you don't mine oil, drill. There you go, to drill for oil. Questions on the different types of leases? Questions on anything so far? You guys are awfully quiet tonight. I don't know if this is good or bad. Okay, I'm going to end here for tonight. Before you go anywhere, just a couple quick reminder. Don't forget, let's see, 2 weeks from tomorrow is your exam. Eek. We're going to talk about rules and expectations, the class before, the rules and expectations for my end of class exam, the class before. But as a reminder, something you guys need to be working on right now is finding a distraction-free area to take your exam. I can't have anybody in the room with you. I can't have you talking to anybody, right? So you guys need to start. Some of you, I know there's a lot going on in your homes. Some of you might even be in the same home, I need you in different rooms. I need you in different parts of the home. I can't have you in the same room together. So if you have any questions about your space, your area, please reach out to me. And guys, I've been asking a lot of questions about, can I take the exam on a phone or a tablet? The whole class recommendation is you take the class on a laptop or a desktop. It's been my experience that the exam works better on a desktop or a laptop. So if you're on an iPhone or a tablet, you may run into some issues that we'll work through. Never fear. If things happen during the exam, we will get through it. I don't have a crystal ball and I can't tell you what might go wrong, but what I do know is we will work through it. So do what you can, get you on a laptop or a desktop. If you have questions about your space, your distraction-free space, please reach out to me before test day. Anything? Anybody good?
Julie, I had a random question.
Okay.
You were talking about as far as the ground space. That's kind of the premise of McDonald's, right? That's how they started off.
I've heard that too. I've heard that's how McDonald's operates as well. It's brilliant, isn't it? Man, I wish I had a hunk of land to let somebody build a McDonald's on and then make proceeds off of that. Again, these are long-term leases. I would say the shortest you're going to do a ground lease is 20 years. If I were a tenant building a Walmart, I would want a 60, 70-year lease, right? Long-term lease. Okay. All right, that's all I got. Look at you guys getting 5 minutes tonight. Y'all have a good night. I'll see everybody tomorrow night, 5:30. We continue unit 11, we'll do unit 12. We just keep going.